Hello everybody, and back again in what somebody described as my garden. I don't think of it as a garden. I think of it as much more of a prison yard, my exercise yard. But so Father Mark must be doing a good job introducing you to the trees that are around about. You can see the trees and the birds and so on. Anyway, welcome back. And I've been talking to you about readings from the Acts of the Apostles in our weekday masses. And when I read them this week, I couldn't help smiling to myself because I had asked you to look particularly for crises in the early church, crises that would, particularly that would bring improvements. And lo and behold, there was no crisis, unless, of course, you can think of St. Paul being thrown out of the synagogue as being a crisis. It's out of the synagogue that was in Antioch in Pisidia, which was that part of Turkey. So don't forget there are two Antiochs, and this was the second one in Turkey. But really, that was really the pattern of the way he worked. That's how his mission worked. He would go to a place, go to the synagogue. He'd be invited to speak, and probably what he had to say would please some, it would put the backs up of others, and eventually he'd be thrown out. He'd then form a little group. Certainly some of them would be Gentiles and non-Jews, but some of them Jews who had followed him, and he'd leave that group to spread the gospel in that area, and then he would move on to another town. And so that was really the way he worked, and that was his sort of missionary way of spreading the gospel. So no crisis last week, except possibly one that was left out of our readings. If you were reading from the Bible, you would notice there was a story left out, or one or two stories left out. They can't include everything, of course, but they left out one about a persecution which was instigated by Herod the king, and he had executed James the Less. That's not Peter, James and John, not that James, but the other James. So he was executed. He was the first martyr from among the apostles, and he'd imprisoned Peter with the idea, no doubt, that he would be next. He would execute Peter as well. But Peter was miraculously escaped from the jail without waking the guards in the middle of the night, and he went to the local house, the mother of John Mark, and woke them up in the middle of the night, and there they hid him, so that Herod's police weren't able to find him, and Herod just seems to have given up. It sort of the whole thing fizzled out. So what could have been a crisis really was next to no crisis at all, other than, I mean, poor James, he lost his life, of course. But what did strike me about the writings was that how far-reaching the last week's crisis, the crisis of that earlier persecution after Stephen had died, after Stephen had been stoned to death, Paul or Saul at that time, he had organized the persecution. That crisis had far-reaching effects. Last week we were concentrating, we said, well, they went to Samaria and Judea, all around, away from Jerusalem. Philip, of course, he played a prominent part. He did have that marvellous conversion of the Ethiopian Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he may have taken the seed of the gospel elsewhere, but that's conjecture. What we do know is that certainly the gospel spread very much more in the Middle East. So, on Tuesday, I don't know whether you can remember the reading, but it began, those who had escaped during the persecution because of Stephen, the ones we were talking about, they travelled as far as Phoenicia, Now that's the Lebanon. Cyprus, so across the sea there to Cyprus, and Antioch. Now that's the Antioch that's in Syria, in northwest Syria, and that was to become sort of hub, a missionary hub for the immediate future. For the Middle East, Paul and Barnabas, they would go, and Paul eventually would of course go to Europe from there. It became the sort of headquarters. They were sent from there, they came back and reported there. Moreover, and this was mentioned even before Paul came on the scene, that they had actually baptized some of the Gentiles, some of the Greeks, and so they had accepted that non-Jews should also become Christians. Now, simultaneously, we also heard this, of course, was further south, St. Peter had been called to the house of a man called Cornelius. Now, Cornelius was an important man because he was a Roman officer in the Roman army, and he was stationed at Caesarea, which was the headquarters